Hey everybody, welcome to Help Me Understand, a podcast where we are seeking biblical clarity through conversation. This is episode 24. So thanks for tuning in, for watching, however it is you found yourself. We are so glad to spend a few minutes with you today. Today we're going to address something that is common to everybody, a question that I think everyone has asked at some point in their lives, or especially in the context of our understanding of Christianity and relating to God. But it's this question: does God want me to suffer? So before we get into that, we have had some good feedback from the last few episodes. In fact, we had a question submitted by Daniel Marcus, who asked about how certain elements of the Bible found themselves into the canon and why there's some markings, like in specifically in Mark or in the Gospel of John, where it says the earliest manuscripts don't contain this passage or this section. It's a great question, and one that probably is going to take longer than just a few minutes to answer. And so in an upcoming episode, we're going to dedicate an entire time of our discussion to finding out how that works and why that happens the way it does.
Yeah, there's some questions around why, so you could have questions like that pop up just as you read through your Bible. You can get a footnote or something that that's like, oh wait, it can almost undermine your confidence in some ways. I don't know if that was happening with Daniel, but it is an interesting question. And also in Mark 16, it says that Christians will be able to pick up snakes.
Right.
So
maybe next time we have some snakes here.
So possibly, we should address that too at the same time.
Snake handling.
You take that part.
Okay. I'll take the part talking about snake handling, not the actual handling of. Anyway, so speaking of snakes, does God want me to suffer? So great question. I've asked it. You've asked it. Where do we begin?
Well, I think it's helpful to think about the will of God here for just a second. You could phrase the question: is it God's will that I suffer? Why does God seem to have chosen certain people to face certain battles? At various stages of life. Like sometimes, really hard things happen. We sometimes, I think, recognize that sickness and suffering are part of a late in life season, but there are questions, I think, that pop up just related to, well, this doesn't seem natural or normal.
Yeah.
Like this is out of bounds. So is it God's will that I suffer?
I think that's really important because for us, suffering is something that we avoid at all costs, and we don't see as a normal part of living. In fact, I think it's fair to say that we spend the majority of our lives doing everything we can to avoid suffering.
Yeah.
So we want ease and convenience and just smooth seas and easy sailing.
Yeah, and in many ways, we seem to think that it's God's job to provide that for us.
Yeah.
And no one would say that, and it's so easy. I want to be careful, I think, not to take a tone of how could you ask that question, right?
Yeah.
That's really easy in times of relative comfort, to kind of make this a mental exercise, and almost for us to look out at someone who might be asking that question and think, how could you even wonder about that? Of course the world is broken and we're going to suffer. So let's try to think about it through that lens. So we can think about the will of God really in two senses. One is his absolute sovereignty over all the events of the world.
So what do you mean by sovereignty?
Yeah, that he is in control of, moving all the pieces around, governing in every sense of the word. And the Bible makes clear that he does so in those ways, in ways that absolutely can't be stopped.
Yeah.
Right? So Psalm 115 verse 3, our God is in heaven and does whatever he pleases. I mean, it doesn't get any clearer than that, right? Psalm 115 verse 3, there is a sense in which God governs everything. And we can look out at our suffering in some ways through that lens. I am dinging here.
Somebody
blowing up.
is questioning right now. They know but it's God's will. It's
Well, I
sovereignly.
got a text from Nick's grandfather just came through right then.
Oh, Nick.
Dr. Bible.
Hey, Doc.
All right.
All right. So do you think it's fair to add on to that, our God is in heaven and does whatever he pleases, and then knowing everything we know about God, we could say, and what he does is right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is a big leap if
Right.
you're suffering.
Exactly. I think it's hard for me to get to that point because I want God to be sovereign when I need him to provide, or I need some sort of assurance or an answer to a prayer, blessing for myself, for my family, for our church. But then it's more difficult for me to go, no, God, whatever you say, whatever you do, how you govern the entire universe, and then specifically my life, you are right in everything that you allow and cause to happen.
Yeah, I think a point of clarification there as well is it doesn't make it good.
Exactly.
Right. So what we're not saying is it's good that people get cancer, right?
Exactly.
However, what God is doing in governing the world has room for categories for in this day and age we live currently right now. Now, one day all suffering is removed. We know that's true. But in this day and age, he has chosen to work through suffering and things that could even be called evil or the result of evil.
Yeah. So you're walking then from overall sovereignty of God in charge of the entire universe, and now individual level God's will for me.
Right. Yep. So absolute sovereignty and then his individual will for our lives. Now, the thing we know most clearly here is that God's will for our lives, and even goes so far as to say this really plainly, is that we would obey him, that we would live in ways that are pleasing to him. That's his will. He wants that for us. Good comes from that, right? There's blessing from obedience. So we think in terms of the moral will of God, where his commandments have been clearly stated to us. This is what I want you to do. Even in 1 Thessalonians in the New Testament, chapter 4, verse 3 says, "For this is God's will, your sanctification." And then he specifically refers to sexual sin. Stay away from sexual immorality. So God's will is on one, from a high view, it is his governing over everything. His will for our lives, the Bible makes clear, is that we would obey his commands.
Yeah.
And what has happened is, of course, we haven't.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah. Why is that? I mean, is it just it's my natural tendency, as even though I am saved and God has redeemed me, there's still the flesh part of me, the old Brett, that desires my own way and wants to be as God is, to have, it's almost like I'm trying to be sovereign over my own life, and by not trusting who God is and what he said, that's how I actually welcome suffering into my life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's fair to say.
Yeah, I think so. So what we really want to know is how these two things come together.
Yeah.
How is it that God governs all the affairs of everyone, everywhere, every day? And how is it that these dynamics of him willing obedience from us and our desires being opposed to that, like how those things come together? So we want to know, does God want me to get cancer? Does God want me to lose my job? Why do children die? Did he cause or allow COVID?
Yeah.
Read the other day, this will not be the worst respiratory virus we will battle in the next 10 years. Have you seen that?
Oh my.
So
No.
where's God, like, we can see that coming. Where's God in governing all of that? Why did my spouse cheat on me?
Yeah.
So it can sound like an obvious answer. It's important for us to always keep in mind that people suffer because of the presence of sin in the world.
And so that comes from somewhere too. I mean, sin entered the world not just arbitrarily, but like sin had this origin, this Genesis 3, Adam and Eve. And so you're saying, like, from what we understand to read in the Bible, that there's a progression of sin enters the world, fallen nature of mankind, and now it's passed down literally environmentally and interpersonally, and then even in my genes, I am living in a broken and fallen and messed up place.
Yeah, that those desires that you speak of have put us in a place where everything is fractured, everything is broken.
Yeah.
In these days, so there is room for this. Isn't something we like to talk about very much. It's really not even in our notes. So there is room for us to say there is some suffering that enters our lives because of our sin.
Yeah.
Specifically tied to things we have done. Why would God allow that or even cause that to happen? How do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's, there's so much there. I mean, my first instinct is to go, there are only some places I get to with God in prayer and worship, just knowing who He is. I only get there when I'm in my brokenness. Like I further understand who God is, and it's not like that doesn't make God like a masochist. Like He's not like trying to just hurt me just so He can watch me squirm. But there is intimacy that I can only find when I'm at that point of need. And I think that's probably the answer I would go for, is my state of I am in complete need for God is a really great place to be. But sometimes I can only get there through difficulty and suffering.
It'd be fair to say there's a grace of suffering, right? Not just a grace in suffering, but a grace of suffering that God gives us.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right what Paul is going for when he's talking about how the thorn in his flesh, he prays that God would remove it 3 separate times, and God refuses to. And the reason being is because there was something that could only come out of Paul and really only happen between God and Paul with the thorn in his flesh.
Yeah. There are some connections that can be made to our direct sin, and God's punishment of that, not in a punitive, like I used the word punishment and then said not punitive. That punishment's probably the wrong word. It's a discipline sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? It's a drawing back of us from our sinful state, because that sinful state is going to produce nothing but pain for us. So there is some space for that. And it's something I think that we often sweep away because we don't know how to draw straight lines from sin to suffering. Right? So we once had friends years ago, almost 20 years ago now, who had a child that was the product of an adulterous affair, and those two were now married. So there was an adultery situation, the wife and this new husband. So the old marriage, he enters in, she gets pregnant, they get married. Child, 5 years old or so, maybe a little bit older, 7 or 8, possibly even, gets a diagnosis that's it's not good.
Yeah.
Long story. The child's fine now, but the question was, is this God's specific judgment on our sin? That's a hard question. I mean, you talk about I think though the Bible makes clear not to just give us wiggle room, right? Like God makes clear that He's sovereign and we're not.
Exactly.
Right? Like we can't say yes, and maybe we can't say no to that question. What we can say is there's no way for us to know.
Right.
God is not holding over your head some decision that you made or action that you took and saying this result.
Yeah. If
Now,
only
sometimes he is, right?
Yeah.
Like I just said, right? Sometimes it's like, okay, you cheated on your taxes.
you're going to pay a fine.
You're going to pay a fine.
You're going to go to jail.
You're going to go to jail, rightfully so.
Yeah.
Is that just the government? No. That's God's judgment on your sin.
Yeah.
Right?
But we know right and wrong because of God. And it's not I understand what you're saying. It's not God going, I'm going to look out and see if I can find all the cheaters. No, it's that the way that justice exists in the world is big. And we've talked about this, I think, before, just in terms of like, how do we know that God exists? Well, that very fact that like we have a sense of right and wrong and a system of right and wrong is because there exists ultimate good. And so it's not a huge leap for us to go, if God has instilled right and wrong into the hearts of people, when we choose to do what's wrong, there's going to be consequences of that. And that's not God going, aha, I got you. It's, this is the world in which you live in.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. And there's a connection on some human levels. Okay, so you go, well, yeah, of course there's legal ramifications for sinning in
That's easy.
illegal ways, right?
Yeah.
There is an unknown and unseen sovereignty that God demonstrates over every aspect of the world that we can't draw all of those connections to, right? So this verse I think is so clear in Romans 8, speaking of what happens in the fall. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in the hope that the creation itself will also be set free from the bondage to decay into the glorious freedom of God's children. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together with labor pains until now. The groaning of our lives, the groaning of the earth, the fact that there are hurricanes sweeping across the world in this season every year, all attributed to not a specific sin that you've committed, but a specific sin that Adam and Eve committed that then was passed down to us.
Yeah.
So the world was broken in those days, or on that day, the world was broken. There's a fracture that's present, and it groans. And part of that groaning, I think, is our inability to connect all the dots.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, I don't know how to pull all this together.
Yeah. And that's easy to see. I mean, it's easy for us to go, of course this is not what it should be like. You know, it shouldn't be that kids are dying and people have cancer and hurricanes are happening and ice caps are melting and elections are dividing families and turning brother against brother. And so it's all of these things are just proof of this is not the way it's going to be forever either.
Right.
And so it draws and turns our attention back to God, where that's not for nothing.
Yeah, that's the beauty of that verse. There's a lot of pain in that verse, but here, when we put this in a gospel perspective, right, there's glorious freedom for God's children.
Yeah.
Like what's coming in the end is healing from all this brokenness. For now, God is using suffering to draw us near, like you were saying, and to shape us, right?
Yes.
We also know Jesus suffered. We are able to say with the Apostle Paul, my goal is to know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. There is suffering in us that brings death to us in places that we can't see or find or touch.
Yeah.
And that God does use suffering to draw us near, to teach us to pray. He may work in that prayer to heal us, to eliminate that suffering.
Yeah.
Or he may choose to say,
yeah,
I'll remain.
That reminds me of, you remember Dave Busby, who was like one of the first youth evangelists, and Dave died of some kind of horrible lung disease, and but I remember him talking even while he was preaching about how there are times when he would pray for God to heal him, and then other times that he would pray for God to heal him of needing to be healed, sort of that conforming his desire into what God's desire was for his life. And that suffering existed, but that it was bringing about a greater good in Dave, even though it meant bringing about a temporary death to Dave's body.
Yeah. Yeah, even you referred to the thorn in the flesh. I mean, it's pretty clear that God tells Paul, stop asking. Right. Eventually, 3 different times he says, I go through these seasons of asking the Lord to take this away, and he keeps saying, my grace is sufficient for you. And so he doesn't. At that point, Paul's conclusion is, okay, I'm not going to ask.
Oh, it's really sufficient.
So
it's sufficient, like forever sufficient. Okay,
right.
Great.
So we pray for suffering to be removed, and it's possible God would say, no, I'm not going to do that. He may say, keep asking me. Maybe I'll do it one day.
Yeah.
I'll keep drawing near in that way, or maybe he says, no, this is.
And it does teach us to pray.
Absolutely.
Like suffering is a great. Everyone prays more when they suffer. What are some blessings in that? What are some good aspects of being taught to pray by suffering?
Yeah, I guess just the trust that's required in that. That's probably how we ought to pray, even in seasons of blessing. Is just to say outcomes. God, that's in your hands, but I totally trust you.
That's good. So where do we go? All right. So we know that God is sovereign. We need that. We need God to be sovereign. We also need the things that we can learn through suffering that we can't learn anywhere else. Learning things about God, dying to ourselves, learning how to pray, learning how to abide in Christ. What does that ultimately accomplish in you? So, we both have different times we can go, I can point to that and go, God was up to something in me, but what's a practical takeaway from going through a season like that?
I think what comes to mind is just the beauty of the long view. To look back over seasons of struggle and to see them in the rearview mirror. Sometimes you knew you were really in a fight, and sometimes it was but over the long haul, that the highs and lows of that, the ability to look back and see God's faithfulness in it. What comes to mind when you think of it?
I think part of that's really true. Just this idea of this world is not my home. Yeah. This is not all that there is or will ever be, and then I think the biggest thing I learned through specific seasons are that God does not owe me easy. He does not owe me a life where everything goes my way and I get what I want on my timetable. That is not in any shape or form the God of the Bible.
Yeah. So. Yeah, the longing that it produces, and that's so much better,
right,
than just the instant gratification. So if you are thinking in a really clear application here, is this what's happening to me today because of that? And we can walk with you through that in any way or pray with you about that. We certainly would love to. Contact us, of course. Contact us in any way, either here at church or through the email that's connected to the podcast, HMU at Arrowhead.Church. And we'd love to walk with you through that. So, first episode, we switched seats. I'm over here. The lighting is totally different.
It's all thrown off. It's it's not like sleeping on the other side of the bed. That'd be a little too weird.
That would be weird. Strange analogy.
Anyway. All right. Until next
thanks,
time.
Guys.